Blood dripped from Kalen Ashgrove's shoulder as he tore through the last line of enemy scouts, his breath ragged, his mind fixed on only one thing: get home. The border fight had dragged on for 3 days, longer than any skirmish in a decade, and every hour away from his den had felt like a blade pressed against his ribs. His pups were alone, his pups were unguarded, and an alpha king who could not protect his own children had no right to call himself a king at all. He signaled his warriors to fall back and regroup at the eastern ridge, then broke away from the pack without waiting for anyone to argue with him. His wolf was already ahead of his human mind, legs eating up the distance across the pine ridge that separated the battlefield from Ashgrove territory. Every step brought a fresh wave of dread. The attack on the border had not been random. Someone had wanted him away from his den, away from Wren and Rook, and that thought alone was enough to make his claws lengthen against his will. By the time the wooden gates of Ashgrove territory rose out of the mist, Kalen had shifted back to his human form, pulling on the spare clothes his guards kept looped to a saddlebag for exactly this reason. His shirt clung to a wound at his side that had not fully closed. He did not care. He shoved past 2 startled sentries at the gate, barely acknowledging their bows, and sprinted the final stretch toward the private den that sat apart from the main hall, tucked behind a wall of birch trees for privacy and protection. He expected to hear crying before he even reached the door. Wren cried when she was frightened. Rook cried when he was hungry, or bored, or simply because his sister was crying and he did not like being left out. Their nursemaid, a nervous young Omega named Yara, had never been able to settle them both at once, not even on quiet days, and these last 3 days had been anything but quiet. War drums had echoed from the border. Smoke had curled over the northern hills. A den full of unguarded pups should have sounded like chaos by now. Instead, Kalen slowed as he approached, his hand hovering near the door. Silence. Complete silence, save for the soft crackle of a low fire and the occasional shift of settling wood. His heart pounded harder than it had during the entire battle. He pushed the door open without knocking, his body braced for the worst, for empty cots, for signs of a struggle, for something far darker than silence should ever promise. What he found instead stopped him cold in the doorway. The den was spotless. Bowls were stacked and washed by the hearth. The pups' scattered toys, which had been a permanent obstacle course for weeks, were tucked neatly into a woven basket in the corner. A fresh set of clothes lay folded on the low bench beside the fire, and the whole space smelled faintly of chamomile and clean linen instead of the usual chaos of unwashed fur and spilled milk. And there, curled protectively on the thick rug near the fire, were his pups. Wren was tucked against a soft, unfamiliar shoulder, her small fist curled into a stranger's sleeve. Rook lay sprawled across the same lap, one chubby hand resting on a woman's wrist, as though he had fallen asleep mid-grip, and refused to let go even in his sleep. The woman herself was asleep too, her head tilted back against the wooden bench, dark hair loose around her face, exhaustion carved into every line of her posture even in rest. She was a stranger. Kalen was certain of that immediately, because no scent in his territory matched hers, and an alpha king knew every scent that belonged to his land, the way he knew the sound of his own heartbeat. He stood frozen for a long moment, torn between 2 instincts that refused to agree with each other. One instinct screamed that an unknown wolf had entered his den, had touched his pups, had made herself comfortable in a place meant only for family. That instinct wanted answers immediately, wanted her upright, and explaining herself before he allowed another second to pass. The other instinct, quieter but far more insistent, held him still. His wolf, usually restless and quick to react, had gone unnervingly calm the moment his eyes landed on her. There was no danger radiating from her sleeping form. No threat in the way her arm curved protectively around his son, or the way her fingers had tangled loosely in his daughter's hair, as if she had been humming her to sleep only minutes before. He crossed the room slowly, each footstep deliberate, and crouched beside the rug to study his children first. Wren's cheeks were flushed with sleep, not fever. Rook's breathing was slow and even, his small chest rising and falling in the deep rhythm of a pup who had been properly fed and properly tired out, not one who had been crying himself hoarse from neglect. Kalen pressed 2 fingers briefly against his son's forehead out of old habit, checking for warmth, for fever, for anything wrong. There was nothing wrong. If anything, his pups looked better cared for now than they had in weeks. That realization, unsettled him more than finding them in danger would have. He turned his attention to the woman. Up close, the exhaustion on her face was even more obvious. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, and her clothes, though clean, were clearly well worn, patched at the elbow, the fabric thinned from long use rather than poor care. Her boots, sitting neatly by the door where she must have placed them before settling onto the rug, showed the wear of someone who walked long distances often, not someone who lived comfortably within four walls. Her hands, when he looked closer, told their own story. They were not soft. Calluses lined her palms in places that spoke of hard, repeated labor, and there was a thin scar across one knuckle that had long since healed white. This was not the hand of a pampered Omega from some neighboring pack sent to spy or seduce. This was the hand of someone who had worked, and fought, and survived on her own for a very long time. Kalen's wolf stirred again, low and rumbling beneath his ribs, but it was not aggression this time. It was something closer to recognition, an ancient and stubborn pull he did not have a name for, and did not trust himself to examine too closely, not while his shoulders still throbbed, and his mind was clouded with 3 days of battle exhaustion. He should wake her. He should demand to know who she was, how she had gotten past his sentries, and why his pups had accepted a total stranger so completely that they slept wrapped around her, instead of screaming the den down the way they usually did with anyone new. Every rule of leadership told him to treat this as a threat first, and a mystery second. Instead, he found himself simply watching her breathe for a long moment, some quiet part of him, unwilling to disturb the first true stillness his den had known in days. It was Rook who broke the silence, stirring against the woman's side and letting out a small, unhappy sound as he searched for warmth that had briefly shifted away when Kalen knelt closer. The woman's eyes opened instantly, sharp and alert, in a way that told Kalen she had never truly been in a deep sleep at all, not the way an unguarded intruder would be. She had been resting the way a soldier rests, ready to snap awake at the first sign of danger. Her gaze found him immediately, and for a heartbeat neither of them moved. Kalen watched her take him in, the blood on his shoulder, the torn shirt, the unmistakable weight of authority that clung to him even half-dressed and exhausted. Recognition flickered across her face, quickly followed by something more complicated. Not fear exactly. Wariness certainly, but underneath it, a kind of tired resignation, as though she had expected to be found eventually, and had simply hoped for a little more time before it happened. She did not scream. She did not scramble away from his pups in a panic, which was what most strangers would have done upon waking, to find the Alpha King looming over them in his own den. Instead, she carefully eased Rook's hand from her wrist, tucking a folded blanket beneath his head to replace the warmth of her side, and did the same for Ren, moving with a gentleness that seemed instinctive rather than performed for his benefit. Only once both pups were settled without waking did she rise to her feet, putting a respectful, but not groveling distance between herself and him. "You're the Alpha," she said, not a question. Her voice was low, a little rough with sleep, but steady. "And you," Kalen said, straightening to his full height, letting the weight of his rank settle into his posture the way it always did when he needed answers, "are in my den, with my pups, and I have never once smelled your scent on my land before tonight." She held his gaze without flinching, which very few people outside his own inner circle dared to do. "My name is Sable," she said simply. "I heard them crying. Nobody came, so I came instead." It was a plain answer, offered without excuses or elaborate explanation, and somehow that made it more believable than any polished story would have. Still, plain and believable were not the same as safe, and Kalen had learned the hard way that danger rarely announced itself with obvious warning signs. "Crying," he repeated slowly. "From where?" "My den sits well behind the tree line." No outsider should have been close enough to hear anything. Something shifted behind her eyes, quick and guarded, gone before he could fully read it. "I was passing through," she said. "Closer to your border than I meant to be. I heard them, and I didn't think. I just came." Kalen studied her in silence, weighing the words against the evidence in front of him, the clean den, the sleeping pups, the exhaustion that suggested someone who had spent every ounce of energy she had left, keeping 2 frightened children calm, rather than resting herself. Every instinct that had kept him alive as Alpha told him to be suspicious of convenient timing. A stranger appearing exactly when his den was left vulnerable was the kind of coincidence that started wars. And yet, Wren shifted in her sleep and murmured something that sounded almost like a name, reaching blindly for the warmth that had stepped away from her, settling only when her small hand found the edge of Sable's sleeve again, without either of them fully waking. Kalen watched his daughter's fingers curl instinctively toward this stranger, the same way she used to reach for her mother, and something in his chest tightened painfully. "They don't do that," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "They don't take to strangers. Not after everything." Sable's expression softened slightly, the wariness easing just enough to reveal something almost sad underneath it. "Pups know who means them harm," she said. "Better than most grown wolves do." Kalen wanted to dismiss that as flattery, as an easy thing to say to soften a suspicious alpha, but the truth of it settled uncomfortably close to what his own wolf had already decided the moment he walked through the door. His pups trusted her. His wolf, against every rational instinct screaming caution, trusted her too. He was not ready to trust anything that came this easily. "You'll stay until I decide what to do with you," he said, his voice sharpening back into command, both for her benefit and his own. A reminder that he was still the one in control here, regardless of how unsettled his instincts had become. "You will not leave this den. You will not speak to anyone outside it, and you will explain, in full, exactly how you came to be here, tonight, when everyone in my territory who wasn't fighting at the border should have been locked safely behind these walls." Sable's jaw tightened, but she nodded once, accepting the terms without argument, which surprised him almost as much as everything else about her had. Most people, guilty or innocent, argued when cornered. She simply absorbed it, the way someone absorbs a sentence they have already resigned themselves to receiving. "Fair enough," she said quietly. Kalen turned toward the door, intending to summon a guard to stand watch, to send for Garrick, his most trusted advisor, to begin unraveling whatever this woman truly was. But before he stepped outside, something made him pause and look back one final time. Sable had already lowered herself back down beside the pups, careful not to disturb them, one hand resting lightly near Rook's back, the way a mother watches over a sick child through the night. She was not looking at Kalen at all. Her attention had already returned fully to the two small, sleeping bodies she had somehow, in the space of 3 days, made feel safe again. He left the den with more questions than he had entered with, and beneath the exhaustion and suspicion, a single unwelcome thought had lodged itself firmly in his chest, and refused to leave. Whoever this woman was, whatever secrets she was clearly hiding behind that steady, guarded gaze, his den had not felt this peaceful in a very long time. And some quiet, dangerous part of him was not entirely sure he wanted that peace to end. Garrick arrived within minutes of being summoned, his gray hair still damp from the fight at the border, a fresh bandage wrapped hastily around his forearm. He had served as Kalen's advisor since before Kalen had taken the crown, and one look at his alpha's face told him something had happened that had nothing to do with the war outside the walls. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Garrick said, stepping into the small study attached to the main hall where Kalen had retreated to think. "Worse," Kalen muttered. "I found someone in the den." Garrick's expression sharpened instantly. "Someone hostile?" "Wren and Rook, are they?" "They're fine," Kalen cut in quickly, before the older wolf's imagination ran too far ahead of the truth. "Better than fine. Fed, bathed, asleep. The whole den was cleaner than it's been in months." Garrick blinked, clearly needing a moment to reconcile the words with the alarm in Kalen's voice. "That doesn't sound like a threat, my king. That sounds like a stroke of luck." A stranger, with no scent tied to any pack I recognize, walked into my den while it was completely unguarded, and my pups accepted her like she'd raised them from birth, Kalen said, pacing the length of the small room. "That is not luck, Garrick. That is either an extraordinary coincidence, or someone planned this." Garrick lowered himself into a chair, wincing slightly at the wound in his arm, and considered this with the same careful patience he brought to every crisis Kalen had ever dragged him into. "What does your wolf say?" Kalen stopped pacing. It was the question he had been avoiding since he'd walked out of that den, because the honest answer unsettled him more than any lie could have. "My wolf didn't want to leave the room," he admitted quietly. "Not out of suspicion, out of something else entirely." Garrick's eyebrows rose, understanding dawning slowly on his weathered face. I see. You see nothing, Kalen snapped, though there was no real heat behind it. I don't know what that reaction means yet, and I won't act on instinct alone when the safety of my pups and my territory could be at stake. I need to know who she is before anything else matters. Then let's find out, Garrick said simply, rising despite his injury. What's her name? Sable, Kalen said. Nothing more. No pack name offered. No explanation beyond claiming she heard the pups crying from outside the border and let herself in. Garrick's expression turned thoughtful. That's either remarkably foolish or remarkably brave, walking into an alpha's den uninvited during an active war. Most wolves with any survival instinct would have kept walking. That's what bothers me, Kalen said. She doesn't act like someone with nothing to lose, but she also doesn't act like someone hiding a plot. She's careful, guarded, like she's used to people asking questions she doesn't want to answer. The two men made their way back toward the den, discussing quietly what steps to take. Kalen wanted answers, but he did not want to frighten the pups by dragging Sable away for a formal interrogation the moment they woke. Garrick suggested a compromise. Post guards discreetly outside the den, allow Sable to remain with the children through the morning under close watch, and question her properly once the pups were occupied elsewhere. It was a reasonable plan, and Kalen agreed to it, though some restless part of him bristled at the idea of anyone else watching over his children, even guards he trusted completely. That reaction, too, unsettled him. He was not a possessive wolf by nature. He had learned early in his reign to delegate, to trust his people, to avoid the trap of believing he alone could protect everything that mattered to him. Yet the thought of leaving Sable unsupervised with his pups, even surrounded by armed guards, made something in his chest tighten in a way he did not fully understand. When they reached the den, dawn light had begun creeping through the windows, casting soft gold across the room. Sable was awake, sitting cross-legged on the rug while Wren sat in her lap, small fingers exploring the frayed edge of Sable's sleeve, with the innocent curiosity of a child who had already decided this stranger was safe. Rook toddled nearby, chasing a wooden toy across the floor, occasionally glancing back towards Sable, as though checking that she was still there. The scene struck Kalen harder than he expected. It had been a long time since his den had looked like this, peaceful, warm, ordinary, in a way that felt almost foreign after months of war meetings and border skirmishes eating away at every quiet moment he might have shared with his children. Sable looked up as they entered, and whatever ease had settled into her posture during the quiet morning vanished instantly, replaced by the same careful wariness from the night before. She shifted Wren gently off her lap, standing to face them directly, as though bracing herself for whatever judgment Kalen had arrived to deliver. "Good morning," Garrick said pleasantly, his tone deliberately light despite the gravity of the situation, a tactic Kalen recognized as an attempt to keep the pups from sensing tension in the room. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Garrick, advisor to the Alpha." "Sable," she offered again, echoing the same brief introduction she'd given Kalen. "Just Sable?" Garrick pressed gently. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Just Sable," she confirmed. Garrick glanced at Kalen, a silent exchange passing between them that said clearly enough, "She's hiding a pack name, and both of us know it." Kalen gave a small nod, acknowledging the observation without pushing the issue in front of the children. "The pups seem quite fond of you," Garrick continued, crouching down to greet Rook, who eyed him with the wary curiosity most pups reserved for unfamiliar adults. A stark contrast to how comfortably he'd been playing near Sable moments earlier. "They were frightened," Sable said simply. "Someone needed to stay with them. And you happened to be nearby," Kalen said, unable to keep the edge of skepticism from his voice. Something flickered across her face. Quick frustration quickly smoothed away. "I've already explained that." "You've explained very little," Kalen corrected. "I intend to learn more, once the pups are settled elsewhere." Sable's eyes flicked briefly toward Wren and Rook, an unmistakable flash of protectiveness crossing her expression, before she caught herself and forced her posture back into neutral calm. "They're comfortable here," she said carefully. "Moving them might upset the balance they've found." "They will be perfectly safe," Kalen replied. "This is still their home. I'm simply asking you to answer questions I cannot ask honestly, with two small children listening to every word." She considered this for a long moment, clearly weighing options Kaelin couldn't fully see, before finally nodding once in reluctant agreement. An hour later, once Wren and Rook had been settled with one of the pack's gentle young nursemaids in the main hall, happily distracted by a basket of colorful blocks, Kaelin and Garrick sat across from Sable in the same small study where the earlier conversation had taken place. She sat with her spine straight, hands folded in her lap, every line of her posture radiating controlled composure, despite the obvious tension beneath it. "Let's begin again," Kaelin said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. "Where did you come from?" "South," Sable said. "Beyond the river territories." "That's not an answer, that's a direction." "It's the only answer I'm prepared to give," she said evenly. Garrick leaned forward slightly, his tone gentler than Kaelin's had been. "You understand our concern, surely. A war is being fought on our border. Someone deliberately drew the Alpha away from his den at the exact moment it was left vulnerable, and then a stranger with no known pack affiliation appears inside that den, caring for his children as though she's done it 100 times before. If you were in our position, wouldn't you ask questions too?" Something in Sable's expression shifted at that, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even reluctant sympathy. "I would," she admitted quietly, "and I understand why you're suspicious. But I had nothing to do with your war, and nothing to do with whoever drew you away from your children. I only wanted to help them. That's all this was." "Then help us understand who taught you to calm a screaming pup in under a minute," Kaelin said. "Or how you knew exactly how much milk to warm without being told, or how to braid a little girl's hair the way her mother used to, when you've never met either of my children before last night." Sable's composure cracked, just slightly. Just enough for Kaelin to catch the flash of old grief behind her eyes, before she buried it again. "I've cared for children before," she said softly. "It isn't complicated. It just takes attention. Most people are too distracted, or too tired, or too afraid to give it properly. I wasn't. It was not the full truth." Kaelin could sense that much clearly, the careful way she chose her words, skirting around whatever experience had actually shaped her instincts so precisely. But it was, perhaps, a piece of the truth, and pushing harder right now seemed unlikely to earn him anything but a woman even more determined to guard her secrets. "You'll remain here," he said finally, "under watch, until I'm satisfied you pose no danger to my pack. In exchange, you'll continue helping with the pups, since it's clear they've grown attached to you faster than they have to anyone in months." Sable studied him carefully, searching his face for some hidden motive behind the offer, before finally giving a slow, measured nod. "That's fair," she said quietly. Then, after a brief pause, added, "Thank you, for not simply throwing me out." "Don't thank me yet," Kaelin said, rising from his chair. "You haven't earned my trust. You've only earned my patience, and even that has limits." As she was escorted from the room by one of the guards, Kaelin remained standing by the window, watching her retreating figure with a complicated knot of suspicion, and something far more dangerous tightening in his chest. "You're going to keep her close," Garrick observed quietly. Not quite a question. "I have to," Kaelin said. "Until I know exactly what she is, I can't risk letting her out of my sight." Garrick studied his Alpha for a long moment, a knowing look settling over his weathered features. "That's not the only reason, is it?" Kaelin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. Word of the stranger in the Alpha's den spread through Ashgrove territory faster than Kaelin would have liked. By midday, the pack's warriors had returned from the border, victorious but exhausted, and the story of a mysterious woman found sleeping beside the Alpha's children had already twisted itself into a dozen conflicting rumors by the time it reached the training grounds. Nora, the sharp-tongued head of the pack's council of elders, wasted no time cornering Kaelin outside the main hall, her silver hair pulled back in its usual severe knot, her expression carved from stone.
"Is it true," she demanded without preamble, "that you're harboring an unknown wolf inside your private den, alongside your heirs, during an active conflict?"
"She's under guard," Kaelin replied evenly, refusing to let her tone rattle him. "And she poses no threat to the pups." "You don't know that," Nora snapped. "You know nothing about her, not her pack, not her bloodline, not her intentions. For all we know, she was placed there deliberately, a weapon planted to strike at the heart of this pack the moment we let our guard down." If that were true, Kaelin said, she had every opportunity to harm them last night, alone, unguarded, with no one to stop her. Instead, I found her asleep beside them, having fed them, bathed them, and settled them more peacefully than they've been in weeks. Or she's patient, Nora countered. Patient enough to earn trust before striking. You cannot afford sentiment right now, Kaelin. Not with the Duskwood aggression still fresh at our border. Banish her. Question her from a safe distance if you must, but do not let her remain inside these walls. Kaelin felt his jaw tighten, old frustration rising at the familiar battle between his instincts and the Council's caution. He understood their fear. He shared it, to some degree. But something about the demand to simply cast Sable out, without further understanding, sat wrong in his chest, in a way he couldn't fully articulate. I will handle this my way, he said finally, his tone leaving no room for further argument. I am still alpha of this territory, and the decision remains mine. Nora's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing further, offering only a stiff bow, before turning on her heel and striding away, clearly displeased, but unwilling to challenge him outright, in the open courtyard, where others might overhear. Kaelin exhaled slowly once she was gone, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. He hadn't slept properly in 3 days, and the weight of leadership pressed heavier than usual against his shoulders, made worse by the unfamiliar tangle of instincts Sable's presence had stirred awake inside him. He found himself walking back toward the den before he'd consciously decided to, drawn by some pull he refused to name. When he arrived, he found Sable exactly where he'd left her that morning, sitting near the low table with Wren perched beside her, small hands wrapped around a wooden spoon as she attempted, with limited success, to feed herself a bowl of porridge. She insists on doing it herself, Sable said without looking up, a faint note of amusement coloring her tired voice. Even though half of it ends up on the floor. She's always been stubborn, Kaelin said, lowering himself into the chair across from them. Takes after her mother. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late mate to Sable directly, and he wasn't entirely sure why the words had slipped out so easily. Sable glanced up at him, something soft and understanding passing briefly across her expression, though she didn't press for more details, which he found himself grateful for. Rook's asleep again, she said instead, nodding toward the small cot in the corner. He tires quickly. More than most pups his age, I think. Kaelin frowned slightly. You've noticed that already? It's hard not to, Sable said. He plays hard for a short burst, then crashes completely. Does he sleep through the night normally, or does he wake often? He wakes, Kaelin admitted. Several times, most nights. Yara always struggled to settle him again once he was up. Sable considered this thoughtfully. Some pups just run warmer than others, especially in their wolf blood. It could simply be his nature settling in early. Or it could mean something else entirely, worth having a healer look at, just to be safe. Kaelin studied her carefully, surprised by the precision of her observation. Most caretakers, even experienced ones, wouldn't think to distinguish between simple temperament and a potential health concern so quickly. You know a great deal about pup development for someone who claims to have no pack affiliation, he said carefully. Sable's expression shuddered slightly, the openness from a moment ago retreating behind familiar caution. I've had reason to learn, she said simply, and offered nothing further. Before Kaelin could press the issue, Wren let out a triumphant squeal, having finally managed to guide a spoonful of porridge successfully to her mouth, and both adults turned their attention to the small victory, the tension of the moment dissolving into quiet laughter that felt, for just a moment, entirely ordinary. That fragile ordinariness didn't last long. Later that evening, as the pack gathered in the main hall for the customary meal following the border victory, whispers followed Kaelin through every corner of the room. He caught fragments as he passed. Outsider, unknown blood, risking the airs. Some of his warriors, men who had fought loyally beside him for years, eyed him with open concern, clearly troubled by rumors of a stranger sleeping so close to the pack's most vulnerable members. Fen, captain of the palace guard, and one of Kaelin's most trusted enforcers, approached him quietly near the edge of the hall, his expression grim. My king, I need to report something you should know before this goes further. Kaelin turned his full attention to him. Go on. I ran a thorough check on the border gates, Fen said. There's no record of anyone passing through the checkpoints during the days of the attack. No sentry recalls seeing a woman matching her description approach from any direction. Kaylin's stomach tightened. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning either our sentries failed spectacularly, which I doubt, given how tightly we secured the perimeter once the fighting began, Fen said carefully, or she entered the territory, through means that bypassed our checkpoints entirely. A hidden path, Kaylin murmured, half to himself. Or she's more skilled at evasion than an ordinary traveler would need to be. There's more, Fen continued, lowering his voice further. I asked around discreetly about the name Sable, cross-referencing it against known pack records from neighboring territories. There's no direct match. But there was an old rumor, years back, about a rival alpha's daughter who vanished after refusing an arranged mating meant to settle a border dispute. I don't have confirmation it's connected, but the timing, and the secrecy surrounding her identity, struck me as worth mentioning. Kaylin absorbed this information slowly, pieces shifting uncomfortably in his mind. A daughter of a rival alpha, vanished, under mysterious circumstances, appearing now inside his own den, during an active conflict. It painted a picture far more complicated than a simple traveler stumbling upon crying children. Which pack? Kaylin asked, his voice low and controlled, despite the tightening dread in his chest. I couldn't confirm that detail, Fen admitted. The rumor was old, and poorly documented. I'll continue digging, discreetly, so as not to alert her that we're investigating further. Do that, Kaylin said, quietly. I don't want this turning into a public accusation until we have something solid. Fen nodded and slipped away, leaving Kaylin standing alone at the edge of the hall, the noise and warmth of the celebration around him, suddenly feeling distant and unreal. He thought of Sable's guarded expression whenever questions about her past arose, the flicker of old grief he'd caught earlier when she spoke of caring for children before, the calluses on her hands that spoke of hardship rather than privilege. If she truly was the missing daughter of a rival alpha, it would explain both her skill and her secrecy. It would also mean she carried far more danger and far more history than she had admitted. He returned to the den later that night, later than he intended, the weight of Fen's information pressing heavily against his thoughts. He found Sable sitting alone by the dying fire, both pups finally asleep in their cots, her expression distant and unreadable in the flickering light. You look troubled, she observed quietly as he entered, not turning to look at him directly. I've learned some things today, Kaylin said, choosing his words carefully. About border checkpoints. About old rumors involving a rival alpha's missing daughter. Sable went very still. The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed, stretching long enough that Kaylin began to wonder if she intended to answer at all. I told you, she finally said, her voice quieter than before, that I came from beyond the river territories. I didn't lie about that. You also didn't tell me the whole truth, Kaylin said, and omission, in my position, is difficult to distinguish from deception. Sable turned to face him fully then, and for the first time since he'd found her, something raw and unguarded flickered openly across her expression. Exhaustion mixed with old, deep-seated fear. If I tell you everything, she said slowly, will you send me away, or worse? I don't know yet, Kaylin admitted honestly. It depends entirely on what that truth is. She was silent for a long moment, staring into the dying flames as though searching for courage within them. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. There are things in my past that could bring danger to your pack, simply by association. I never meant to stay this long. I meant to help your children through one bad night, and disappear before anyone noticed I'd been here at all. Why didn't you? Kaylin asked quietly. Sable's gaze lifted to meet his, something complicated and painfully honest passing between them in that shared look. Because they needed me, she said simply, and it had been a very long time since anyone needed me for something good. Kaylin felt something shift dangerously in his chest at those words, some careful wall he'd built around his instincts cracking just slightly wider. He wanted to press further, to demand the full truth immediately, but exhaustion and the late hour, combined with the fragile honesty finally passing between them, made him hesitate. We'll speak more of this tomorrow, he said finally, fully. No more half-truths. Sable nodded slowly, something like relief and dread mixing equally across her tired features. Tomorrow, she agreed. As Kaylin turned to leave, she called softly after him. For what it's worth, she said, whatever you learn about my past, the care I've given your children has never been anything but real. He paused at the doorway, glancing back at her one final time, before stepping out into the cool night air. I believe that part, he said quietly. It's everything else I'm still trying to understand. The walk back to his own quarters felt longer than usual, his mind circling endlessly around the pieces Fen had given him, and the raw honesty he'd just witnessed in Sable's expression. Somewhere beneath the layers of suspicion and political danger, an uncomfortable truth was taking root in his chest, one he wasn't yet ready to face directly. Whatever Sable was hiding, whatever danger her past might bring to his door, some deep and stubborn part of his wolf had already decided she belonged here. And that quiet certainty frightened him more than any enemy he'd faced on the battlefield. Morning arrived with a heavy gray sky, clouds pressing low over Ashgrove territory, as though the weather itself sensed the tension building within its walls. Kalen had barely slept, his mind cycling endlessly through everything Fen had uncovered, and the fragile honesty Sable had finally offered the night before. He rose early, dressed quickly, and made his way toward the council chamber, where he knew Nora and the other elders would already be waiting, eager to press their case for banishment before he'd even had breakfast. He was not wrong. The moment he entered the chamber, Nora rose from her seat, flanked by two other senior council members, their expressions uniformly grim. We've heard troubling reports overnight, Nora began, without waiting for formal greetings. Captain Fenn's inquiry into border security, and the rumors surrounding a missing rival, Alpha's daughter. Tell me these reports are exaggerated, Kalen. They're not exaggerated, Kalen said, taking his seat at the head of the table, refusing to let her tone push him into a defensive posture. But they're also not confirmed. I intend to speak with Sable directly today to learn the full truth. The full truth, one of the other elders, a heavy-set man named Colton, repeated skeptically. My king, with respect. She has had 2 days to offer that truth freely, and has instead offered half answers and evasions. Every hour she remains inside this pack unaccounted for is an hour of unnecessary risk. I'm aware of the risk, Kalen said evenly. I'm also aware that rushing to banish or punish someone based on incomplete rumors could cost us information, and potentially an ally, that we cannot afford to lose given the current conflict with Duskwood territory. Nora's eyes sharpened at the mention of Duskwood. You believe she's connected to them? I believe it's possible, Kalen admitted, which is precisely why I intend to learn the truth myself, rather than acting rashly on rumor alone. The council debated the matter for nearly an hour, voices rising and falling as arguments were traded back and forth across the table. Some elders sided cautiously with Kalen's measured approach, recognizing the potential value of understanding a possible connection to their most persistent rival. Others remained firmly convinced that any risk, however small, was unacceptable so close to the pack's heirs. In the end, Kalen held firm to his authority, agreeing only to a compromise. Sable would remain under close guard, questioned formally and thoroughly, with Garrick present, to ensure fairness, and a final decision would be made, based on what emerged from that conversation. The council reluctantly accepted these terms, though Nora's parting glance as the meeting adjourned made clear her disapproval remained fully intact. Kalen found Sable exactly where he expected, in the den, though today she looked different somehow, her posture stiffer, her expression carefully composed, in a way that told him she had spent the night bracing herself for exactly this conversation. The council knows, she said quietly, before he'd even fully entered the room. About the rumors, I mean. News travels quickly in a pack this size, Kalen said, closing the door behind him to give them privacy, especially news involving potential threats to the heirs. Sable's jaw tightened slightly, though she said nothing in immediate response. Garrick entered a moment later, offering Sable a small, reassuring nod before taking a seat slightly apart from the two of them, close enough to witness the conversation, but far enough to make clear he wasn't there to intimidate her further. I promised you the full truth today, Kalen said, settling into the chair across from her. I intend to hold you to that same promise. No more partial answers. Sable was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale with the effort of maintaining her composure. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, though clearly costing her considerable effort to keep it that way. My birth name is not Sable, she began, though it's the name I've used for years now, and the only one I answer to willingly. Kalen felt his chest tighten, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, allowing her the space to continue without interruption. I was born into a pack you may have heard of, she continued. One that has, for a long time, held an uneasy rivalry with your own territory. I won't name it yet, not until I'm certain doing so won't bring danger crashing through your gates before I've finished explaining. Duskwood, Kalen said quietly. It wasn't quite a question, though he watched carefully for her reaction. Sable flinched, just slightly, confirmation enough without needing to voice the word herself. Yes, she admitted after a moment. Duskwood. Garrick shifted slightly in his seat, though he remained silent, allowing Kalen to continue leading the conversation. Continue, Kalen said, keeping his voice deliberately even, despite the tension coiling tighter in his chest. I was the eldest daughter of the Duskwood Alpha, Sable said. Groomed from birth, for a role I never wanted, expected eventually to seal some political arrangement, through an arranged mating, meant to benefit the pack, regardless of my own wishes in the matter. When I was old enough to understand exactly what that meant, and exactly who I was expected to bind myself to, I refused. That's not typically a request an alpha's daughter is permitted to make, Garrick observed quietly. No, Sable agreed, a bitter edge creeping briefly into her tone. It isn't. My refusal was treated as a betrayal, both of my family and my pack's interests. I was stripped of my title, publicly disgraced, and left with very few options beyond compliance or exile. You chose exile, Kalen said. I chose survival, Sable corrected quietly. I've spent years since then, moving between territories, never staying long enough to be recognized, never using my birth name, learning to live without the protection or resources a pack normally provides its own. I learned to care for myself, and eventually, when circumstances required it, to care for others as well. Kalen absorbed this slowly, pieces of the puzzle finally settling into place. Her calloused hands, her guarded nature, her precise understanding of pup care despite claiming no formal pack affiliation, all of it now made painful, complete sense. The night you found me in your den, Sable continued, I genuinely was passing near your border, farther from my usual paths than I intended to travel. I heard your children crying, and something in me simply couldn't walk past that sound and keep going. I know how it feels to be left alone, frightened, with no one coming. I couldn't do that to them, regardless of the risk it posed to myself. And the connection to the attack on our border, Kalen pressed carefully. Was that coincidence, or something more deliberate? Sable's expression turned genuinely troubled at that question. I don't know, she admitted. I've had no contact with Duskwood in years, no knowledge of their current plans or movements, but if my father has learned I'm alive, and nearby, it's possible the timing wasn't coincidental at all. It's possible I was tracked here, and the attack on your border was arranged specifically to separate you from your den, creating an opportunity someone believed I would exploit. The implication hung heavy in the room. If true, it meant Sable herself had unknowingly been used as bait, or worse, that her presence inside Ashgrove territory had placed Kalen's entire pack at greater risk than any of them had previously realized. If Duskwood believes you're here, Kalen said slowly, they may attempt to retrieve you, by force if necessary. I know, Sable said quietly, which is exactly why I intended to leave, before anyone discovered I'd stayed this long. I never meant to bring this danger to your door. And yet you stayed anyway, Kalen observed, knowing the risk. Sable met his gaze directly, something fierce and unwavering settling behind her exhausted eyes. Your children needed someone. I couldn't leave them unprotected simply to protect myself. I've made that choice before, choosing my own safety over someone else's need, and I've regretted it every day since. I wasn't willing to make that mistake again. Garrick cleared his throat quietly, breaking the heavy silence that followed. My king, if I may, regardless of the political complications this presents, I believe what she's telling us is the truth. And more importantly, I believe her intentions toward Wren and Rook have never been anything other than genuine. Kalen studied Sable for a long, silent moment, weighing everything she'd revealed against every instinct his wolf had stubbornly refused to abandon since the moment he'd found her sleeping in his den. The danger was real. The political complications were significant. And yet, beneath all of it, The fierce protectiveness in her voice when she spoke of his children rang unmistakably true. "You'll remain here," he said finally, "under increased protection, rather than mere suspicion. If Duskwood believes you're within these walls, we'll need to prepare our defenses accordingly, regardless of whether they come for you directly or use this as further pretext for aggression along our border." Relief flickered briefly across Sable's face, quickly tempered by renewed guilt. "I never wanted to make your position more difficult," she said quietly. "You didn't create this conflict," Kalen said. "Your father did, years before either of us ever crossed paths. I won't hold you responsible for choices that were never yours to make." Something shifted in Sable's expression at those words, a wall she'd clearly maintained for years cracking just slightly beneath unexpected understanding. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me." "Don't thank me yet," Kalen said, echoing words he'd spoken to her once before, though this time the edge behind them had softened considerably. "We still have a war to prepare for, and now, quite possibly, a far more personal battle waiting just beyond our borders." As the meeting concluded and Sable retreated back toward the pups, who had begun stirring in their cots, Garrick lingered behind briefly, studying Kalen with quiet consideration. "You believe her," he said, not a question. "I do," Kalen admitted, "which terrifies me considerably more than doubting her ever did." Garrick allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "Trust often does, my king, especially when it arrives somewhere you least expected to find it." The days that followed settled into a rhythm Kalen hadn't realized he'd been missing until it finally arrived. With Sable's history now understood, the constant undercurrent of suspicion that had colored every interaction between them began to ease, replaced gradually by something quieter and far more dangerous to the careful walls he'd built around his own heart. Rook's night terrors, which had plagued him for months without any nursemaid finding a lasting solution, began to fade almost entirely under Sable's care. She discovered, through patient observation, that he settled fastest when someone hummed a low, steady rhythm against his back, rather than attempting to soothe him with words, a technique that worked so consistently that even Kalen found himself standing in the doorway some nights, quietly amazed at how quickly his son's cries dissolved into peaceful silence. Wren, meanwhile, had latched onto Sable with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion only small children seemed capable of offering so completely. She insisted on having her hair braided each morning, in the specific pattern Sable had shown her, 3 careful sections woven tightly against her scalp, a style that bore an uncanny resemblance to the way Kalen's late mate had once worn her own hair. He'd mentioned this only once, quietly, expecting the observation to create awkwardness between them. Instead, Sable had simply nodded, unbothered, explaining that she'd learned the pattern years ago from an old friend, and had never had reason to use it until now. Kalen found himself drawn back to the den more often than his duties strictly required, inventing reasons to check on the pups that grew increasingly transparent even to himself. He told himself it was simple prudence, an alpha ensuring the safety of his heirs during an uncertain political situation. But the truth, growing harder to ignore with each passing day, was that he sought out Sable's presence for reasons that had very little to do with caution, and everything to do with the strange, persistent pull his wolf refused to release. It happened one quiet evening, nearly a week after her arrival, that the pull became impossible to dismiss any longer. Kalen had come to the den, intending only a brief check before retiring for the night, but found Sable sitting alone by the fire, both pups finally asleep, her expression softer and more relaxed than he'd seen it since her arrival. "You should rest," he said, lingering in the doorway rather than announcing himself immediately. "You've barely slept properly since you got here." Sable glanced up, a tired but genuine smile touching her lips. "Old habits," she admitted. "I've spent so many years sleeping lightly, ready to move at a moment's notice." Kalen crossed the room and settled into the chair across from her, closer than strict necessity required, though neither of them commented on the distance. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Whatever else remains uncertain between our territories, within these walls, you have nothing to fear." "I want to believe that," Sable said, staring into the low flames. "It's been a long time since I allowed myself to believe anything of the sort, about anywhere." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling fire filling the space between careful words, Neither of them seemed ready to speak aloud. Kaylin studied her profile in the firelight, the sharp intelligence behind her tired eyes, the quiet strength evident in every guarded movement she made, and felt that same unfamiliar pull tighten further in his chest. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, breaking the silence. Sable turned to face him fully, curiosity flickering across her features. "Of course. That first night," Kaylin said slowly, "when I found you asleep beside my children, my wolf reacted to you immediately, not with suspicion, not the way it should have reacted to an unknown intruder, but with something closer to recognition. I've spent days trying to convince myself it was simply exhaustion, or relief at finding the pups safe, but it hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown stronger." Sable's breath caught softly, and for a long moment she said nothing, her expression cycling rapidly through surprise, wariness, and something achingly vulnerable underneath both. "I felt something too," she admitted quietly. "That first night, I told myself it was simply gratitude, that you hadn't immediately thrown me out, or worse, but it hasn't faded for me either." The admission hung heavy between them, fragile and dangerous in equal measure. Kaylin knew exactly what such recognition typically meant among wolves, the ancient pull that marked a true mate bond, but he hesitated to name it aloud, uncertain whether doing so would frighten her away or bind them both to something neither was fully prepared to navigate given everything else at stake. "I don't know what to do with that information," he admitted honestly. "Given everything else surrounding your presence here, the danger from Duskwood, the political complications, my responsibility to my pack and my children." "Neither do I," Sable said softly. "I never expected to feel this again, not after everything I walked away from. I convinced myself a long time ago that this kind of connection wasn't meant for someone like me, someone who chose exile over the life I was supposed to live." "Why not?" Kaylin asked, genuinely curious, despite the complicated tangle of emotion coloring the question. Sable was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts carefully before answering. "Because the last time I trusted a connection like this, it cost me everything I thought I understood about my own family. I'm cautious now, about believing in things that feel too easy, too immediate." "This hasn't felt easy," Kaylin pointed out gently. "Every step of this has been complicated by suspicion, politics, and danger neither of us fully controls." A small reluctant smile touched Sable's lips at that observation. "No," she agreed, "it certainly hasn't been easy." "Perhaps that's precisely why it feels real," Kaylin said quietly. "Nothing worth trusting arrives without some difficulty attached to it." They sat together a while longer, the conversation gradually shifting to lighter topics. Stories from Sable's years of travel, careful and selective though they were, and memories Kaylin shared of his own early days as a young, uncertain alpha, learning to lead a pack, still grieving the loss of his predecessor. For the first time since he'd taken the crown, Kaylin found himself speaking freely to someone who hadn't known him before. The weight of leadership settled permanently onto his shoulders, someone who saw him clearly in the present moment, rather than through the lens of expectation and history. It was well past midnight by the time Kaylin finally rose to leave, reluctant in a way he hadn't anticipated feeling. At the doorway, he paused, glancing back at Sable one final time. "Whatever this is," he said quietly, "I don't intend to rush it. Not with everything else at stake, but I also don't intend to pretend it isn't happening." Sable met his gaze steadily, something warm and cautiously hopeful flickering behind her tired eyes. "Neither do I," she said softly. He left the den that night with a lighter heart than he'd carried in longer than he cared to admit, though the underlying tension of Duskwood's potential retaliation still hummed steadily beneath every quiet moment of peace he allowed himself to enjoy. The following morning brought fresh reports from the border, confirming increased Duskwood activity along the eastern ridge, a development that quickly pulled Kaylin's attention back toward the practical demands of leadership. Yet even amid renewed war preparations, he found his thoughts returning constantly to the den, to the quiet warmth of Sable's presence, and to the fragile, growing certainty that whatever danger lay ahead, he no longer intended to face it without her standing beside him. Garrick noticed the shift immediately, watching his alpha move through daily council meetings with a renewed steadiness that had been noticeably absent during the difficult weeks following his mate's death years earlier. He said nothing directly, choosing instead to offer quiet support wherever needed, though the knowing look he occasionally exchanged with Kaylin made clear he understood exactly what had changed. Even Nora, though still openly skeptical of Sable's continued presence within the pack, found herself softening slightly after witnessing the genuine transformation in both the pup's happiness and Kaylin's overall demeanor. She remained cautious, unwilling to fully trust someone connected so closely to their most persistent rival, but the sharp edge of her earlier hostility dulled slightly with each passing day of peace within the den. Wren and Rook, oblivious to the complicated political and emotional currents swirling around them, simply continued thriving under Sable's steady, patient care, their laughter filling the den more frequently and more freely than it had in longer than Kaylin cared to remember. For the first time since losing his mate, Kaylin allowed himself to imagine a future that included genuine happiness, alongside his duties as alpha, a fragile hope he hadn't realized how desperately he'd been missing until Sable's quiet, steady presence had gently coaxed it back to life. But hope, he knew from painful experience, often arrived alongside renewed danger, and somewhere beyond his borders, forces were already stirring that threatened to challenge everything he'd only just begun allowing himself to want. The report arrived just before dawn, carried by a breathless scout who had ridden through the night without rest. Kaylin met him in the courtyard, still pulling on his coat against the early chill, Fen close behind him, with a torch held high against the darkness. Duskwood scouts, the young messenger gasped out, struggling to catch his breath. Spotted along the eastern ridge, closer than any previous patrol, at least a dozen, moving with purpose rather than simply patrolling the border. Kaylin's stomach tightened. Heading which direction? Toward us, my king. Directly toward Ashgrove territory. Fen exchanged a grim look with Kaylin, both men understanding immediately what this likely meant. If Duskwood had confirmed Sable's location within Ashgrove walls, a direct approach rather than another distraction attack suggested they intended retrieval rather than further aggression, a far more personal and dangerous mission than a simple territorial dispute. Double the border patrols immediately, Kaylin ordered, and send word to the council. We need to prepare defenses along the eastern approach before they arrive. As the scout hurried off to relay orders, Fen turned to Kaylin with quiet concern. If they're coming for her specifically, they may attempt something more subtle than an open assault. Infiltration, perhaps, or an attempt to draw her out under false pretenses. Then we ensure she's never alone, and never near the border unguarded, Kaylin said firmly. I won't let them take her. Fen studied him for a moment, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. You've decided then? Regarding her place here. I decided some time ago, Kaylin admitted. I simply hadn't said it aloud yet. By mid-morning, the entire pack had been alerted to the increased Duskwood presence along the border, and a tense energy settled over Ashgrove territory, as warriors prepared for the possibility of renewed conflict. Kaylin made his way to the den immediately after the council meeting concluded, determined to speak with Sable before rumors reached her through less careful channels. He found her already tense, having clearly sensed the shift in atmosphere throughout the pack even before he arrived. Something's happened, she said the moment he entered. Wren clutched instinctively closer against her hip. Duskwood scouts have been spotted near our eastern border, Kaylin confirmed, moving with clear purpose, closer than typical patrol patterns. Sable's face paled slightly, though her voice remained steady. They know I'm here. It appears likely, Kaylin admitted. I've increased security throughout the territory, and I won't allow you anywhere near the border unguarded, until we better understand their intentions. This is exactly what I feared, Sable said quietly, guilt heavy in her voice. I should have left the moment I suspected they might be tracking me. I never should have let it come to this, endangering your entire pack because of my own history. Stop, Kaylin said firmly, stepping closer and gently setting a hand against her shoulder. This is not your fault. Your father made these choices long before either of us became involved. You are not responsible for his actions, nor for the conflict that existed between our territories, long before you ever arrived here. Sable met his gaze, something fragile and uncertain flickering behind her eyes. And if they come for me directly? If facing them means putting your pups, your entire pack, at greater risk? Then we face that together, Kaylin said firmly. I won't hand you over simply to avoid conflict, Sable. Not now. Something shifted in her expression at those words, relief mixing with renewed fear in equal measure. Why? She asked softly, Why risk so much for someone you've known such a short time? Kaylin considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to give her the full truth, rather than a simplified version easier to voice. Because from the moment I found you in that den, something in me recognized exactly what you are to me, even before I fully understood it myself. I've spent years since losing my mate, convinced I would never feel that pull again, that leading this pack alone was simply the life I'd been given. You've changed that. Whatever risk comes with keeping you here, I find I'm no longer willing to imagine a future without you in it. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Sable's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, clearly unaccustomed to allowing herself such open vulnerability. I feel the same, she admitted quietly. I've spent so long protecting myself from exactly this kind of connection, convinced it would only lead to more pain. But I can't deny what's grown between us, not anymore. The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant, until Rook's sudden cry from across the room broke the tension, both adults quickly redirecting their attention toward the immediate demands of caring for the pups. Yet something had solidified between them in that brief exchange, an unspoken commitment neither of them fully understood the consequences of yet, but neither was willing to abandon, regardless of the danger gathering just beyond their borders. Over the following days, Duskwood's presence along the eastern ridge continued growing steadily more concentrated, though no direct attack materialized. Kaylin's scouts reported increasingly organized encampments, suggesting a prolonged siege rather than a hasty raid, a development that troubled the council considerably. They're waiting for something, Garrick observed during one particularly tense strategy meeting. Reinforcements, perhaps, or simply the right moment to strike with maximum advantage. Or they're hoping to draw her out through pressure rather than direct assault, Fenn added. Prolonged tension can wear down resolve far more effectively than open conflict sometimes. Kaylin listened carefully to these assessments, his mind constantly weighing strategic considerations against the fierce protectiveness that had settled permanently into his chest regarding Sable's safety. He refused to consider any option that involved surrendering her to Duskwood, regardless of the political complications that refusal might create. Sable herself grew increasingly restless as the days passed, torn between gratitude for Kaylin's protection and mounting guilt over the continued strain her presence placed on Ashgrove's resources and security. She began spending long hours near the den's windows, watching the distant tree line, with an expression Kaylin recognized as someone bracing themselves for confrontation they knew was inevitably approaching. "You're not planning something reckless, are you?" Kaylin asked one evening, finding her in exactly that position, staring silently toward the eastern horizon. Sable turned to face him, exhaustion and determination mixing plainly across her features. "I've considered it," she admitted honestly. "Walking out to meet them directly, offering myself in exchange for guaranteed peace along your border. It would end this standoff quickly, without further risk to your pack." "Absolutely not," Kaylin said immediately, sharper than he intended. "I won't allow that." "It might be the only way to protect Wren and Rook properly," Sable argued. "I can't bear the thought of your children caught in danger because of choices that trace back entirely to my own family's conflicts. And I can't bear the thought of losing you to protect a peace that Duskwood has no genuine intention of honoring," Kaylin countered firmly. "Trust me when I say this, Sable. Surrendering you would not end this conflict. It would simply remove the one thing standing between your father and whatever larger ambitions he holds toward this territory." Sable's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining from her posture as exhaustion took over. "I don't know how much longer I can watch this tension grow without doing something," she admitted quietly. "Then let me handle the strategy," Kaylin said gently, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. "Trust me to protect what matters to both of us. I promise you, I have no intention of losing this fight, or losing you." Sable searched his face for a long moment, something in her wary heart finally settling into fragile trust. "All right," she said softly. "I'll trust you." That fragile trust would be tested sooner than either of them anticipated. Just 2 nights later, as the pack settled into uneasy sleep, a lone Duskwood messenger appeared at Ashgrove's main gate, demanding immediate audience with the Alpha regarding, as the messenger phrased it, the return of stolen property, currently residing within Ashgrove's walls. Kaylin received the message with cold fury, immediately understanding the deliberate insult embedded within the phrasing. Sable was not property to be returned. She was a person who had chosen exile over compliance, and now, increasingly, a woman who had chosen to remain by his side, despite the danger that choice carried. He prepared to meet the messenger himself, determined to make Duskwood's true intentions, and his own unwavering position, absolutely clear before this conflict escalated any further. The Duskwood messenger stood rigid at the gate, flanked by two silent guards whose posture suggested they were prepared for violence should the meeting turn hostile. Kalen approached with Fen and Garrick at his sides, deliberately projecting calm authority, despite the fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. "Speak your message plainly," Kalen said, stopping a deliberate distance from the messenger, close enough to convey confidence, far enough to avoid any appearance of eagerness for negotiation. The messenger, a lean man with sharp features and cold eyes, offered a shallow bow before straightening to deliver his words with practiced formality. "Alpha Corvin Duskwood sends greetings, and a demand for the immediate return of his daughter, currently sheltering within your territory, under circumstances he considers a grave insult to his authority and his pack's honor." "Your Alpha's daughter," Kalen said evenly, "left his territory of her own choosing, years ago, after refusing to be bartered away in a political arrangement against her will. If she remains within my territory now, it is because she has chosen to remain, not because she has been taken or kept against her wishes." The messenger's expression flickered with poorly concealed irritation. Alpha Corvin does not recognize her departure as legitimate. She remains, by blood and birthright, a daughter of Duskwood, and her continued absence, particularly within rival territory, constitutes an unacceptable provocation. "Then Alpha Corvin's grievance lies with his daughter's choices, not with anything I have done," Kalen replied firmly. "I extend no invitation for her removal, nor will I permit any attempt to retrieve her by force. She remains here, under my protection, of her own free will." The messenger's jaw tightened, clearly having anticipated resistance, but perhaps not quite this level of direct defiance. "Alpha Corvin instructed me to make clear that failure to comply peacefully will be viewed as an act of aggression, one that justifies whatever measures he deems necessary to reclaim what is rightfully his." "Tell your Alpha," Kalen said, his voice hardening further, "that threatening my territory over a grown woman's personal choices will be met with exactly the same resistance any unprovoked aggression would receive. I have no interest in prolonging conflict between our packs, but I will not sacrifice an innocent person's safety and autonomy simply to avoid it." The messenger studied Kalen for a long moment, something calculating passing behind his cold eyes before he offered a final shallow bow. "I will relay your response precisely, Alpha Ashgrove. I suspect you understand what it likely means for the days ahead." "I understand perfectly," Kalen said. "And we will be prepared for whatever response follows." The messenger and his guards departed without further words, disappearing back into the tree line toward Duskwood territory, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Garrick exhaled slowly once they were well out of sight. "That went about as well as we could have hoped, and about as badly as we feared," he observed dryly. "They were never going to accept a peaceful resolution," Kalen said grimly. "Corvin sees this as a matter of pride and territorial dominance, not genuine concern for his daughter's well-being." Fen nodded in agreement, his expression tight with the particular focus of a warrior, already calculating defensive strategies. "We should assume this means an attack is imminent, likely sooner rather than later, given how directly you challenged his authority." "Then we prepare accordingly," Kalen said, turning back toward the main hall. "Full defensive readiness along the eastern border, and increased protection, specifically around the den. If Corvin intends to attempt retrieval by force, I want every possible approach anticipated and countered before it begins." The following days passed in a blur of intense preparation. Kalen called upon every resource Ashgrove territory possessed, reinforcing border patrols, coordinating strategic positions with his most experienced warriors, and ensuring the pack's defenses remained as strong as possible against whatever assault Duskwood might launch. Throughout it all, he made certain Sable and the Pups remained under constant, careful protection, refusing to allow even a moment's vulnerability that Duskwood might exploit. Sable herself grew increasingly withdrawn as the tension mounted, guilt weighing visibly heavier on her with each passing day. Kaylin found her one evening sitting alone in the den long after the pups had fallen asleep, staring at nothing in particular, her expression distant and troubled. "You're carrying too much of this on your own shoulders," he said gently, settling beside her. "How can I not?" Sable asked, her voice tight with restrained emotion. "Every warrior preparing for battle right now, every risk your pack is taking, exists because of choices connected entirely to my past. I told myself, when I first considered staying to help your children, that the danger would be manageable. I never imagined it would escalate to open conflict." "You didn't create this conflict," Kaylin reminded her firmly, echoing words he'd spoken before but clearly needing repetition, given the guilt still weighing so heavily on her. "Corvin's ambitions toward this territory existed long before you returned to my life. If anything, your presence has simply given him an excuse to pursue aggression he likely intended, eventually regardless." "That's a generous interpretation," Sable said quietly. "But it doesn't erase the fact that people may be hurt, possibly killed, defending a choice that ultimately centers around me." Kaylin took her hand gently, waiting until she met his gaze directly before continuing. "Sable, listen to me carefully. Every warrior within these walls fights not simply to protect you, but to protect the values this pack holds dear. The belief that no one should be forced into a life they didn't choose, that autonomy and safety matter more than political convenience. You are not a burden we've reluctantly accepted. You are someone worth protecting and worth fighting for." Tears finally spilled freely down Sable's cheeks, months, perhaps years, of carefully guarded emotion, finally breaking through the composed exterior she'd maintained for so long. Kaylin pulled her gently into his arms, holding her steadily as she allowed herself, perhaps for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel supported rather than isolated in facing danger. "I don't know how to accept this kind of care," she admitted softly against his shoulder. "It's been so long since anyone offered it without expecting something in return." "You don't need to know how immediately," Kaylin said quietly. "Just allow yourself to accept it, slowly, for as long as it takes to feel natural again." They remained like that for a long while, the quiet warmth of shared comfort settling gradually over the fear and tension that had gripped them both throughout the preceding days. When Sable finally pulled back, her expression had shifted, exhaustion still present but tempered now by renewed resolve. "Whatever happens," she said firmly, "I want you to know that staying here, choosing this, choosing you, has been the first decision in years that has felt entirely my own, made freely, rather than out of fear or necessity. Regardless of how this conflict resolves, I don't regret that choice." "Neither do I," Kaylin said softly, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead. "And I intend to make certain we both have a future to continue choosing each other in." The following morning brought confirmation of exactly the threat they'd been anticipating. Scouts reported a substantial Duskwood force gathering along the eastern ridge, far larger than any previous patrol, clearly organizing for a coordinated assault rather than another simple skirmish. Kaylin gathered his council and warriors immediately, finalizing defensive strategies with grim determination. "They mean to strike within days, perhaps even within hours," Fenn reported, studying the latest scouting information with focused intensity. "Their numbers suggest a full assault, not a targeted retrieval attempt. Corvin appears committed to resolving this through overwhelming force rather than negotiation." "Then we meet that force with equal determination," Kaylin said firmly, addressing his assembled warriors and council members with the steady authority that had carried Ashgrove through countless previous challenges. "We are defending our territory, our families, and the fundamental right of every person within these walls to choose their own path, free from coercion. I will not allow Corvin's ambition to dictate the fate of this pack, nor the fate of the woman who has already proven herself far more valuable to this territory than any political convenience Duskwood might offer through her surrender." A murmur of firm agreement rippled through the assembled warriors, resolve settling visibly across every face present. Even Nora, watching from her position among the council elders, offered a slow, respectful nod, her earlier skepticism finally giving way to genuine support for the position Kaylin had chosen to defend. As preparations intensified throughout the day, Kaylin made one final stop before the anticipated conflict, returning to the den to spend precious moments with his children and with Sable before whatever chaos the following hours might bring. He found all three together, Wren and Rook playing quietly nearby, while Sable watched over them with fierce, protective attention. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, drawing her into a brief, steady embrace, "know that I intend to return to this den victorious, with you and our family safe within it." Sable searched his face for a long moment before nodding firmly, determination replacing earlier fear in her steady gaze. "Then go," she said softly, "and know that I'll be here, ready to fight alongside you if it comes to that, rather than hiding away while others risk everything on my behalf." Kaelin studied her carefully, recognizing immediately the fierce warrior spirit she'd clearly suppressed during years of careful exile, now finally reawakening beneath the surface of quiet caution she'd maintained since her arrival. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you," he said, a small, proud smile touching his lips despite the gravity of what lay ahead. As he departed to join his assembled warriors along the eastern border, Kaelin carried with him not just the weight of protecting his territory, but the powerful certainty that whatever battle awaited, he now fought for something far more personal and precious than mere political advantage. He fought for the family he had unexpectedly found, and for the fierce, resilient woman who had somehow, in the span of just a few short weeks, become as essential to his heart as the children he had sworn from birth to protect. The attack began just before sunrise, exactly as Fen had predicted. Horns sounded from the eastern watchtowers, cutting through the quiet morning air with urgent, repeated blasts that sent every warrior in Ashgrove territory scrambling toward their assigned positions. Kaelin was already dressed and armed, having spent the final hours of darkness reviewing defensive positions with his commanders, rather than attempting sleep he knew wouldn't come easily anyway. "They're moving in 3 separate columns," Fen reported, arriving at Kaelin's side with a scout's hastily drawn map. 2 along the main eastern approach, likely intended as a direct assault to draw our forces forward. The 3rd is smaller, moving along the northern tree line, away from our main defensive line entirely. Kaelin studied the map with sharp focus, understanding immediately what the smaller, separate column likely represented. "A diversion," he said grimly. "They want our attention fixed on the main assault while a smaller, more mobile force attempts to slip around our defenses entirely." "Toward the den," Garrick said quietly, arriving just in time to hear the assessment, his expression tightening with concern. "Exactly," Kaelin confirmed. "Corvin has no intention of engaging in a costly, prolonged battle simply for territorial gain. He wants his daughter, and he's using this assault as cover to retrieve her directly, while our main forces are occupied elsewhere." The realization sharpened Kaelin's strategy immediately. "Fen, take command of our main defensive line against the 2 primary columns. Hold them firmly, but don't overextend our forces chasing a decisive victory there. Garrick, I need a small, highly capable unit redirected immediately to reinforce protection around the den. I'll lead that unit myself." "My king, your presence is needed at the main defensive line," Garrick protested immediately. "The pack's morale depends on seeing you lead that fight directly." "My pack's morale depends far more on knowing their alpha protects what matters most, regardless of where that protection is needed," Kaelin countered firmly. "Fen is more than capable of leading our main defense. I trust him completely with that responsibility. But I will not risk Sable and my children to a diversion tactic simply because tradition demands my presence elsewhere." Garrick studied him for a brief moment before nodding, recognizing the unwavering determination in Kaelin's expression. "Understood, my king. I'll assemble your unit immediately." Within minutes, Kaelin led a small, tightly coordinated group of his most trusted warriors away from the main defensive preparations, moving swiftly and quietly toward the den through less obvious paths that would allow them to intercept any approaching threat before it reached its intended target. His heart pounded with a mixture of battle focus and raw, protective fear, every instinct sharpened by the knowledge of exactly what and who he was racing to protect. They arrived at the den's perimeter just as the first signs of movement became visible along the northern tree line, shadows shifting between the trees in careful, coordinated patterns that confirmed exactly the infiltration attempt Kaelin had anticipated. He signaled his warriors into defensive positions, positioning himself directly between the approaching threat and the den's entrance. Inside, Sable had already sensed the shift in atmosphere, years of careful survival instinct alerting her to danger before any direct confrontation began. She gathered Wren and Rook close, moving them toward the den's most protected interior corner, while remaining alert and ready to defend them herself, if circumstances required it. The Duskwood infiltration force emerged from the tree line moments later, 6 warriors moving with practiced coordination, clearly selected specifically for this precise, targeted mission, rather than open combat. Their leader, a broad-shouldered enforcer with cold, calculating eyes, halted upon spotting Kalen and his warriors positioned firmly between them and the den. "Alpha Ashgrove," the enforcer said, his tone carrying grim amusement rather than surprise. "Anticipating our approach, I see." "Your diversion tactic was clever," Kalen replied evenly, positioning himself with deliberate calm, despite the fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. "Unfortunately for you, not clever enough." "Alpha Corvin's patience has reached its limit," the enforcer said. "We're authorized to retrieve his daughter through whatever means necessary. I'd advise you to step aside, unless you're prepared to see considerable bloodshed over a woman who isn't even truly yours to protect." "She is precisely mine to protect," Kalen said, his voice hardening into unmistakable authority. "By her own choice, and by the bond my wolf recognized the moment I found her caring for my children. You will not take her from this territory. Not today, not ever, while I still draw breath." The enforcer's expression flickered with brief calculation, before hardening into grim resolve. "Then we proceed with whatever means necessary," he said, signaling his warriors forward. The clash that followed was brutal, but brief. Kalen's carefully selected warriors more than a match for the smaller Duskwood infiltration unit, despite being slightly outnumbered. Kalen himself fought with fierce, focused intensity, every strike driven by the singular determination to ensure no threat reached the den's entrance. He took down 2 warriors in quick succession, his movements sharp and precise, despite the exhaustion of previous days' preparations weighing heavily against his stamina. Inside the den, Sable listened to the sounds of combat drawing closer, her protective instincts overriding years of careful caution. She positioned herself firmly between the pups and the entrance, grabbing a heavy iron poker from beside the hearth, prepared to defend her family with whatever means available should the fighting breach the den's walls. It nearly did. One Duskwood warrior, having slipped past the main confrontation through a gap in the defensive line, reached the den's entrance directly, only to find Sable waiting with fierce, unwavering resolve. The brief struggle that followed was intense but decisive. Sable's unexpected combat skill, honed through years of dangerous survival on her own, proving more than sufficient to repel the single attacker until reinforcements arrived moments later to finish subduing him. By the time the brief but intense skirmish concluded, the remaining Duskwood infiltrators had either been subdued or had retreated back toward the tree line. Their mission clearly failed. Kalen, breathing hard but largely unharmed beyond minor cuts and bruises, rushed immediately toward the den, his heart pounding with residual fear, until he confirmed with his own eyes that Sable and the pups remained entirely safe. He found Sable still gripping the iron poker tightly, adrenaline visibly coursing through her system. Wren and Rook huddled close, but remarkably calm, given the chaos that had briefly threatened their home. The moment she spotted Kalen, relief flooded visibly across her features, the poker slipping from her grip as she crossed the room quickly to meet him. "You're safe," she breathed, relief and lingering fear mixing in her voice, as Kalen pulled her firmly into his arms. "So are you," he replied, holding her tightly for a long moment, before pulling back, just enough to examine her carefully for injuries. "Are you hurt? The children?" "We're fine," Sable assured him. "Frightened, but unharmed. You arrived exactly in time." Kalen glanced back toward his warriors, who were efficiently securing the subdued Duskwood infiltrators for questioning, before returning his full attention to Sable and the pups. "This confirms it," he said grimly. "Corvin won't stop pursuing you through subtle means. This attempt failing only means he'll escalate further." "Then we need to end this decisively," Sable said, her earlier fear giving way to fierce, determined resolve. "Not simply defend against endless attempts, but confront this directly, once and for all." Kalen studied her carefully, recognizing the same unwavering strength that had first drawn his wolf's recognition weeks earlier, now fully reawakened and burning steadily behind her determined gaze. "I agree," he said firmly. "It's time to end this properly, rather than simply reacting to whatever Corvin attempts next." As reports arrived confirming Fen had successfully repelled the main Duskwood assault along the eastern border with minimal Ashgrove casualties, Kalen began formulating a new strategy, one that would move beyond simple defense toward direct, decisive confrontation with Corvin himself. Enough danger had already threatened his family. It was time to ensure, permanently, that Sable's freedom and his family's safety would never again hang precariously in the balance of Duskwood's relentless ambition. 3 days after the failed infiltration attempt, Kalen called together his full council, his war commanders, and every ally he could summon on short notice, determined to bring the conflict with Duskwood to a permanent, decisive resolution. Reports from captured infiltrators, questioned carefully but firmly by Fen, had confirmed exactly what Kalen suspected. Corvin's ambitions extended well beyond simply reclaiming his daughter. He viewed the current conflict as an opportunity to test Ashgrove's defenses and potentially expand his own territorial influence should Kalen's forces prove weaker than anticipated. "We cannot allow this to continue as a slow, grinding conflict," Kalen told his assembled council, standing at the head of the war table, with maps spread across its surface. "Corvin will keep testing our defenses, keep searching for weaknesses, until either he succeeds in some future attempt or exhausts himself against our resistance. Neither outcome serves us well in the long term." "What do you propose instead?" Nora asked, her earlier skepticism regarding Sable now fully replaced by focused strategic concern for the pack's overall well-being. "A direct confrontation," Kalen said. "Not another defensive battle, but a formal challenge, delivered directly to Corvin, demanding he stand before witnesses from neighboring territories to answer for his aggression. I intend to publicly and formally claim Sable as my mate, removing any ambiguity about her status or her right to remain here freely. If Corvin wishes to challenge that claim, he'll need to do so openly, before allies who can judge the legitimacy of his continued aggression against a pack that has done nothing but defend an individual's fundamental right to choose her own path." The council debated this proposal at length, weighing the risks of such a bold public move against the potential benefits of finally resolving the conflict decisively, rather than continuing to absorb repeated attacks. Ultimately, recognizing that quiet defense alone had already failed to deter Corvin's escalating aggression, the council agreed to support Kalen's strategy. Sable, when informed of the plan, received it with a complicated mixture of fear and fierce determination. "You would do this publicly," she said carefully, "knowing it means directly challenging my father before witnesses, understanding fully what that might provoke." "I would," Kalen confirmed. "Because hiding this connection, treating it as something to be cautious or ashamed of, has only allowed Corvin room to believe he might still succeed in reclaiming you through force or intimidation. A public formal claim removes that ambiguity entirely. And if he refuses to accept it, if he escalates further rather than backing down, then we'll have the support of witnessing territories who understand exactly what's at stake, allies who can help pressure Corvin toward reasonable resolution rather than continued aggression," Kalen said. "I won't pretend this carries no risk, Sable. But continuing as we have, simply defending against repeated attempts, carries risk as well, indefinitely, without any clear path toward lasting peace." Sable considered this carefully, her expression cycling through fear, calculation, and finally settling into firm resolve. "Then let's do this properly," she said. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of being treated as property to be fought over, rather than a person capable of choosing my own path. If facing my father directly, publicly, is what it takes to finally end this, I'm ready." The formal gathering was arranged within the week, held at a neutral location along the border between Ashgrove and Duskwood territories, with representatives from several neighboring packs invited to witness the proceedings as impartial observers. Corvin arrived with a substantial contingent of warriors, his expression carrying the same cold calculation that had clearly shaped Sable's earliest years under his authority. Kalen stood before the assembled witnesses with Sable at his side, both of them dressed formally, their posture radiating unified strength despite the tension crackling through the gathered crowd. When Corvin's gaze finally settled on his daughter, something flickered briefly behind his cold eyes, quickly suppressed beneath practiced composure. "Alpha Ashgrove," Corvin said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly. "You've called this meeting to discuss the return of my daughter, I presume." "I've called this meeting," Kalen replied firmly, to formally and publicly declare Sable as my chosen mate, and to demand, before these witnesses, that you cease all further aggression against my territory, regarding a matter that has never been yours to dictate." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd at the directness of this declaration. Corvin's expression hardened considerably. "She remains, by blood, a daughter of Duskwood, regardless of whatever claim you now attempt to establish." "She remains an individual capable of choosing her own path," Kaelin countered. "A choice she made years ago, when she refused your attempt to barter her into a political arrangement against her will. And a choice she continues to make now, standing here beside me freely, without coercion of any kind." Corvin's gaze shifted to Sable directly, something almost pleading beneath the cold authority he'd maintained throughout the exchange. "Daughter," he said, his tone softening slightly, though clearly for the benefit of the watching witnesses rather than genuine reconciliation. "Return home. Whatever grievances remain between us can surely be resolved without further conflict." Sable met her father's gaze steadily, years of accumulated fear and resentment finally finding voice before witnesses who could bear testimony to her words. "I have no home to return to, Father. Not one that ever valued me as anything beyond a political tool to be traded for advantage. I found something different here, something I never expected to feel again after everything I walked away from. I choose Ashgrove. I choose Kaelin, and I choose to finally live a life shaped by my own decisions, rather than yours." The assembled witnesses murmured amongst themselves, clearly moved by the raw honesty in Sable's declaration. Corvin's expression tightened with poorly concealed fury, though the presence of neutral observers from multiple territories clearly constrained his ability to respond with open aggression. "This is not resolved simply because you declare it so," Corvin said, addressing Kaelin directly once more. "You've made a formal claim before witnesses, yes, but that claim means nothing if I choose to contest it through whatever means remain available to me." "Then contest it," Kaelin said calmly, openly, before these same witnesses, rather than through cowardly infiltration attempts and diversionary attacks designed to avoid direct accountability. "If you genuinely believe your grievance holds merit, present it formally, and allow these gathered representatives to judge the legitimacy of your continued aggression against a pack that has done nothing beyond protecting an individual's fundamental right to choose her own future." Corvin's jaw tightened, clearly recognizing the trap embedded within Kaelin's challenge. Any formal complaint presented before neutral witnesses would require him to justify his original attempt to barter his daughter into an unwanted arrangement, a detail unlikely to earn much sympathy from packs who valued individual autonomy as highly as most territories did. The neutral witnesses, sensing the shifting dynamics of the confrontation, began murmuring more pointedly amongst themselves, several exchanging glances that suggested growing sympathy for Kaelin and Sable's position, rather than Corvin's increasingly untenable stance. Recognizing the shifting tide of public opinion, Corvin's expression shifted from cold fury toward calculated retreat. "Perhaps," he said slowly, clearly forcing the words through gritted teeth, "this matter requires further consideration before any formal contest proceeds." "Perhaps it requires simply this," Kaelin countered firmly, "your acknowledgement, before these witnesses, that Sable's choice to remain within Ashgrove territory, as my mate, is legitimate, and your commitment to cease all further aggression against my territory, regarding this matter permanently." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, every witness present clearly aware that Corvin's next words would determine whether this conflict finally reached resolution, or escalated toward a far more dangerous confrontation, involving multiple territories drawn into judgment over the dispute. Finally, visibly swallowing his pride before the watching assembly, Corvin offered a stiff, reluctant nod. "I acknowledge the claim," he said, each word clearly costing him considerable effort, "and I commit to ceasing further aggression against Ashgrove territory regarding this matter." A wave of visible relief rippled through the gathered witnesses, several offering approving murmurs at the resolution reached without further bloodshed. Kaelin felt Sable's hand tighten around his own, relief and lingering disbelief mixing plainly across her features, as the weight of years of fear finally began lifting from her shoulders. As the formal gathering concluded, and witnesses began dispersing back toward their respective territories, Corvin lingered briefly, his gaze settling one final time on his daughter. "I hope," he said quietly, words meant only for her rather than the departing crowd, That whatever life you've built here brings you more happiness than the one I offered ever could have. Sable studied her father for a long moment, old hurt and cautious hope mixing behind her steady gaze. It already has, she said simply, before turning away, leaving her father's complicated legacy behind her at last, and stepping fully into the future she had finally, freely chosen for herself. The weeks that followed the formal confrontation with Corvin brought a peace to Ashgrove territory that Kaelin had not felt since long before his mate's passing, years earlier. With Duskwood's aggression formally ended, and witnessed by neutral territories who would hold Corvin accountable should he ever attempt to violate the agreement, the constant tension that had gripped the pack finally began to ease into genuine, lasting calm. Sable's transition into her new role within Ashgrove came gradually but steadily. The council, led increasingly by a genuinely warming Nora, welcomed her formally into their gatherings, recognizing both her sharp intelligence and the fierce loyalty she had already demonstrated toward the pack's well-being. Warriors who had initially regarded her with suspicion now greeted her with respect, many having witnessed firsthand the courage she'd shown defending the den during the infiltration attempt. The pups, of course, needed no formal introduction or gradual acceptance. Wren and Rook had claimed Sable as an essential part of their family from nearly the very first night, and their obvious joy at her permanent presence within the den only grew more evident with each passing day. Wren began insisting on calling her Mama Sable during quiet moments, a title Sable received with visible emotion each time, tears gathering in her eyes, despite the joy clearly accompanying them. Kaelin watched this transformation unfold with quiet, steady happiness, the weight of grief and loneliness he had carried since losing his first mate, finally easing into something resembling genuine contentment. He found himself laughing more freely during council meetings, approaching daily challenges with renewed patience and perspective, and looking forward to returning home each evening with an eagerness he hadn't experienced in longer than he cared to admit. One evening, several weeks after the confrontation with Corvin had finally resolved the lingering threat from Duskwood, Kaelin returned from a routine border inspection to find the den bathed in warm evening light, the familiar sounds of Wren's laughter and Rook's delighted babbling drifting through the open window as he approached. He paused at the doorway, struck by the powerful echo of that very first night when he'd returned from battle to find Sable asleep beside his sleeping children. The scene before him now carried the same essential warmth, but everything else had transformed completely. Sable was not asleep this time, but very much awake, sitting on the floor with both pups engaged in an animated game involving wooden blocks and considerable dramatic sound effects on Rook's part. She looked up as he entered, her face breaking into the kind of genuine, unguarded smile that had become increasingly familiar over recent weeks, though it still struck him with the same powerful warmth every single time. "You're home early," she said, rising to greet him, as Wren immediately abandoned the block game in favor of demanding to be lifted into her father's arms. The border inspection went smoothly, Kaelin said, scooping Wren up and pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead before turning his attention fully to Sable. "Peaceful, for once, without any lingering complications requiring my immediate attention." "Peaceful," Sable repeated, something soft and grateful coloring her voice. "I don't think I'll ever grow tired of hearing that word applied to this territory." "Neither will I," Kaelin admitted, setting Wren down gently as Rook toddled over, demanding equal attention with an insistent tug on his father's pant leg. Later that evening, once both pups had finally exhausted themselves into peaceful sleep, Kaelin and Sable sat together beside the fire, much as they had during those early uncertain nights when everything between them remained fragile and undefined. Now, months later, the comfortable silence between them carried none of that earlier uncertainty, replaced instead by the deep, settled contentment of two people who had chosen each other fully, through danger and difficulty, and found something genuinely lasting on the other side of it. "I've been thinking," Sable said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence, "about everything that's happened since that first night you found me here." "What about it?" Kaelin asked, shifting slightly to study her expression in the warm firelight. "I spent so many years believing that connection, family, genuine belonging, simply wasn't meant for someone like me," Sable said thoughtfully. "Someone who'd walked away from everything she'd been raised to become, who'd chosen survival over the safety a pack normally provides." I convinced myself that isolation was simply the price I'd chosen to pay for my own freedom. And now? Kaylin prompted gently. Sable turned to face him fully, warmth and quiet certainty settling across her features. Now I understand that freedom and belonging aren't opposites at all. I found both here, with you, with Ren and Rook, in a way I never imagined possible after everything my father tried to force upon me. This den, this family, has become the truest home I've ever known, not because it was given to me, but because I finally chose it freely, and it chose me back. Kaylin felt his chest tighten with emotion at her words, reaching over to gently cup her face in his hands. You've given this family something it desperately needed, long before either of us understood exactly what that missing piece was. I lost so much when I lost my first mate. Not just companionship, but a certain kind of hope that things could ever feel whole again. You've restored that hope, Sable, in ways I don't think I can fully express through words alone. Then perhaps, Sable said softly, a teasing warmth entering her tired but genuinely happy expression, we simply continue expressing it through actions instead, one ordinary, peaceful day at a time. Kaylin smiled, drawing her close and pressing a gentle kiss against her lips, warm and unhurried, carrying none of the fear or uncertainty that had once shadowed even their most tender moments together. For as many days as we're fortunate enough to be given. Outside, the Ashgrove territory settled into peaceful evening quiet, its borders secure, its pack strengthened rather than diminished by the trials it had faced together. Within the den, a family that had formed from unlikely circumstances, tested by danger and strengthened by choice, settled comfortably into the kind of ordinary, treasured happiness that neither Kaylin nor Sable had ever truly expected to find, yet both now understood they would fight without hesitation to protect for the rest of their lives. The story that had begun with a startled Alpha discovering a mysterious stranger asleep beside his children had, through courage, honesty, and hard-won trust, become something far more enduring. A true home, built not on obligation or convenience, but on the quiet, powerful strength of two people who had chosen, again and again, to stand together, regardless of whatever danger or uncertainty life continued to place before them. And as Ren and Rook grew older within the safety of that chosen family, they would come to know, without ever needing to be told directly, that the woman who had once been found sleeping in their den as a stranger had, from that very first night, already begun becoming exactly what she was always meant to be, their mother, in every way that truly mattered, and the heart of a home finally, fully complete.